Anyway, I'm Tricia Wilson, Professor of Primary and Community Care, heading up the new Kent Academic Primary Care Unit. So very excited about the inaugural seminar for our year's seminar programme. So the Academic Primary Care Unit, also known as KAPCU, was set up about a year ago when I came into post. And it's all about developing a hub, a centre for research excellence in primary and community care, being a magnet to draw people into the region and to really increase research capacity in the region. And I think we've managed to come up with a really exciting seminar programme for the year. All topics were suggested by colleagues out in primary and community care, and I'm open to suggestions for next year's programme. And also any comments about the way we've run it, the timing, etc. We can modify for next year's programme. The next seminar is in June at our other campus in Medway, where I've not actually been yet. I'm going tomorrow to try and find it. We've got Steve Iliff talking about dementia, so that should be a really good seminar. And I've been told it's out of term time, so parking should be very easy. But today, I'm really pleased to introduce Kate Hamilton-West. I was very keen to have a homegrown researcher to kick us off, because when I came to the area, I realised there was some really outstanding research going on. And Kate is a bit of a unique researcher in self-management, because she's a psychologist by background, so an expert in health behaviour change, but is also someone that I've got to know who also recognises the contextual and the sociological implications and influences around self-management. So she really comes with that very broad perspective, and I'm sure we're going to have a really interesting seminar. She's going to take about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for some discussion and questions afterwards. So over to you, Kate.
Okay, thanks very much, Tricia, and thanks everyone for coming today. I'm really honoured to be asked to kick off this seminar series for the Kent Academic Primary Care Unit, and to be invited to talk about a topic that is very close to my own heart, something I've been researching for about 15 years. That topic is helping patients to self-manage their long-term condition. Okay, so I'm going to start today by giving a bit of context around chronic illness and why this is a particular challenge to the health service. I think this is probably something that many of you in the room are already very familiar with. I'll then move on to think about what it is we mean by self-management, how this term is defined, and also how self-management is studied. I'm then going to turn to look at how research can inform the development of interventions and strategies to help people self-manage their long-term condition. And then finally, I'll present some examples of evidence-based approaches. I'll be really happy to take some questions at the end. Okay, so long-term conditions or chronic diseases are those that can be managed but often not cured. So this includes conditions such as diabetes, arthritis, asthma, a number of cardiovascular diseases, HIV, AIDS and certain cancers. There are around 15 million people in England with one or more long-term condition, and this represents about 30% of the population. And also this figure is predicted to rise. Multimorbidity is also becoming increasingly prevalent, with the number of people living with 3 or more long-term conditions predicted to reach 2.9 million in 2018. And so because of this, recent reports have highlighted the need for major changes in the NHS in order to respond effectively to the increasing numbers of people living with long-term conditions. And this is likely to include changes to the way services are organised and delivered, as well as a greater emphasis in the future on evidence-based interventions and strategies to help people self-manage. And I'm going to be focusing today particularly on this part that's highlighted in red here. So I'm not going to say an awful lot about the way services are organised and delivered. I'm going to talk really about what research tells us about how best to help people self-manage their long-term condition. Okay, so what do we mean by self-management? Well, if you delve into the research literature, you'll find that people use all sorts of different definitions of self-management, and there's no one university-agreed definition. Also, a lot of the definitions that are used overlap with related concepts. So there's overlap with concepts such as coping with a long-term condition or adapting to a long-term condition, although there's some differences in these definitions as well, which can make it quite a difficult area to research. In very general terms, self-management refers to the things people do to help themselves live with a long-term condition, and this is the definition that's used by Self-Management UK. And one of the reasons that self-management is so difficult to define, as Laurie and Holman have pointed out, is that really anything a person with a long-term condition does or does not do can be seen to reflect their approach to self-management. So in essence, one cannot not self-manage. In terms of approaches to studying self-management, there are two main approaches that I want to talk about today. The first is qualitative research. This is research that focuses on patients' experiences of living with and managing long-term conditions. And the second, which is my background and area of research, is health psychology research. And this involves developing models and theories that can be used to explain individual variability among people with the same condition in terms of cognition, emotion and behaviour, and can also be used to develop theory-based interventions and strategies. So both of these are very broad areas of research, and I'm just going to provide sort of a brief overview and a flavour of these areas of research today. I apologise for the noise on the microphone. Okay, so qualitative research can provide a really rich insight into patients' experiences and the reasons why self-management can be challenging. And some of you might be familiar with a website called Health Talk Online. If you haven't come across this yet, it's a really useful resource for gaining an insight into the types of challenges people with different types of conditions face on a day-to-day basis. These are interviews that have been conducted by researchers at the University of Oxford, and they make some parts of these interviews available as videos on the website, so you can go and use them for research and teaching purposes. And just to highlight how useful these interviews can be, I've included an interview from someone called Darren who has diabetes. He's going to be talking about his experiences of living with and managing the condition. So I'm hoping that I can go to this link now. Okay, here we are.
So I don't know, you get down days, don't you? And I definitely do. And I do feel like there is this whole big issue of permanently being ill, which I can't escape from. I take my medication 4 times a day. I inject twice a day, prick my finger numerous times a day, bleed for my disease. So yeah, some days it's hard to deal with that, and I do feel like it's robbed me of a few joys, just a few things, little simple things, and now and again it just crops its head up and just smacks you a bit, really. When you want to sort of, we talk about mortgages, and then you realise, how much the insurance will be for a new mortgage because they're going to whop on these extra bits of money because you're a diabetic. And you are about going away on a trip, and then you think about the travel insurance and how much that's going to cost because you're a diabetic. And you go out and it's just simple stuff like at college. We all eat together on a Wednesday night, and I get a special dessert comes back from me of fruit. It's always fruit. They've got no imagination other than fruit. So, everybody else is sort of eating their apple pie and custard, and there's my fruit. So, It's just stuff like that when I think about it, I get a bit annoyed about the whole thing and a bit cheesed off with my genetics and a bit cheesed off with everything really. But I suppose because I've been to that really bad place, I'm really very good at getting my act together when I get a bit down. I do work hard at making sure that I don't go there and don't dwell in that place. I work very hard mentally and spiritually on bringing myself back out of that place as quickly as I possibly can. But I can imagine that for other people, dwelling in that place would be quite soul-destroying. It just chips, it doesn't take the joy of life away, it just chips a little bit off the edge. And now and again, it cheeses me off.
Okay, so I think you can see just from that short 2-minute interview on there how rich that information is about the way Darren experiences diabetes on a day-to-day basis and the way the condition impacts on his life in lots of different ways. Okay, so another reason that qualitative research is really valuable is that it helps to identify sets of self-management tasks. So to really define what it is we mean by self-management, what this covers. So Corbin and Strauss in the 80s identified 3 sets of self-management tasks. So there are those that are involved in medical management, such as taking medication and attending appointments. There are those that are involved in behavioural management, such as adapting lifestyles and roles. And there are those that are involved in emotional management, such as managing anger, frustration and fear for the future. And being able to identify these sort of defined tasks helps to develop research to see how people do this successfully. And I think you could also see this coming out in Darren's interview just now, that living with a long-term condition really involves quite a sort of a mix of all of these types of tasks, and they're all interrelated with each other as well. Another qualitative study that I'd like to highlight, a more recent study by Kinder and Greenhall in 2012, followed people managing diabetes very closely to look at the types of tasks that they engaged in on a day-to-day basis. And they also looked at what they call non-self-management, which is occasions where the person could have done something active to manage their diabetes, but they didn't, and they wanted to find out what was going on, what was happening there. And they found that self-management of diabetes was extremely complex. They put together a very, very long list of the tasks that people engaged in to be able to manage their diabetes. And they found that non-self-management tended to occur in contexts where people's material, intellectual or emotional resources were stretched, for example, due to poverty, low health literacy, a demanding family or social context, or multiple comorbidity. And they highlight that these findings really warn against a narrow focus on the individual's knowledge, attitudes and behaviour, and that they suggest the need for a much broader approach, which includes training health professionals to recognise, value and effectively support the efforts of a self-managing patient. And this is where I'd like to turn to health psychology research. So health psychology is an applied branch of the broader discipline of psychology, which is concerned with understanding and improving health in the healthcare system. And there are numerous models and theories within this field that can help to understand individual differences in cognitive, emotional and behavioural responses to illness. And these models and theories can also be used to develop theory-based interventions and strategies, and to train health professionals to support self-managing patients. So I'm not going to attempt to cover all of these models and theories today, but I'm going to highlight a few of the key theories and look at how they've influenced the development of interventions and strategies. So the model here, the health belief model, is one of the earliest models of health behaviour change, going back to the 1960s. And according to this model, people will take preventive health action, such as taking medication or quitting smoking, if they believe that they're susceptible to a disease, if they believe that disease is serious, and if they believe that the benefits of taking action outweigh the barriers. And the model also suggests that people can be cued to take action, for example by media campaigns or information or advice from their GP or from family members or other sources. And this model has a number of advantages and disadvantages. One of the main advantages is that it emphasises the role of individual beliefs and highlights that these can be quite different from those of the health professional. And this really emphasises that people are not just passive recipients of information in medical consultations, that they process the information, they form their own beliefs, and it's those beliefs that guide their behaviour. The model also recognises that behaviour change has both advantages and disadvantages, and this is a key principle underlying an approach called motivational interviewing, which I'm going to look at a bit later. In terms of disadvantages, one of the main disadvantages is this is a really rational model. It suggests that people process information almost in the way that a computer would process that information and weigh up the pros and cons of actions before performing particular health behaviours, which seems very unlikely to be true, both from research evidence and also just from our own observation of human behaviour. It's very difficult to explain why people drink, smoke, overeat, and so on in terms of this model. These are behaviours where the risks are really well known. People are not smoking because they don't know it's harmful. There's something more going on there that is not accounted for in this model. The model also leaves out a role for emotion, and we could see in Darren's interview earlier how important emotional responses to illness are and how they shape the way people manage their condition. And the model is focused on the individual's beliefs, so it's not really taking into account the context around that individual. The second model I'd like to look at today is the theory of planned behaviour. And this model suggests that behaviour such as quitting smoking or exercising, for example, is predicted by an intention to carry out that behaviour. And this intention is predicted by 3 types of beliefs. So the first type is behavioural beliefs that you can see at the top there. And this is beliefs about the behaviour, whether it has benefits, whether it's a good thing to do. So if I think quitting smoking is a good thing to do, it's going to have benefits for me, I'm more likely to form an intention to quit. The second type of belief is normative beliefs, and this is what I believe about the beliefs of others. So if I believe that the people around me, the people that I'm influenced by, think that I should quit smoking, then I'm more likely to form an intention to quit smoking. And the third type of belief is control beliefs. So this relates to how much control do I think I have over this behaviour? Do I think I actually can quit smoking if I want to do so? And it's these 3 types of beliefs that influence intention. The model also weights these beliefs by the importance or power of each outcome or attribute. So if you're looking at normative beliefs, for example, we can look at not only what do I think others think I should do, but also how motivated am I to comply with them. And you can actually calculate an equation using these questionnaires to work out what the likelihood is of someone forming that intention. And if you're interested in this model, there's a website there that tells you how to go about constructing a questionnaire and measuring each of these predictors. So this model also has advantages and disadvantages. One of the main advantages over the health belief model is that it recognises that there are also social influences on health behaviour. So our decisions are not just a process of weighing up the pros and cons, but we're also influenced by what other people think that we should do, or what we would normally refer to as peer pressure. The model also recognises that perceived control is an important predictor of health behaviour, and actually there's lots and lots of research to show that perceived control, how much I think I can carry out a behaviour, is one of the key predictors of actually carrying out that behaviour. There are, however, a number of important disadvantages with this model. The most important disadvantage is that all of these behaviours predict intention. The intention is only useful if it actually predicts behaviour, but we know with a lot of behaviours that the behaviour doesn't follow on from an intention, and certainly long term there can be quite a low correspondence between intention and behaviour. So if we look at figures for smoking cessation, for example, people who've formed an intention to quit and have even successfully quit in the short term, if you follow them up 12 months later, they're highly likely to be smoking again. And it's the same for weight loss. If you look at people who have formed an intention to change the way they eat or to change their physical activity levels, they've successfully lost weight. You follow them up 12 months later, again, the vast majority are back to the weight they were before. So we know that forming an intention is not enough to be able to carry out that behaviour. Another disadvantage is that this model is still really rational. It still suggests that we sort of calculate these equations and weigh up all the sort of pros and cons in order to decide on behaviour. And that seems pretty unlikely, particularly in the moment when someone picks up a cigarette or picks up the chocolate biscuit or makes that decision whether they're going to go to the gym or not. I mean, are they really, every time they do that, going through this rational process? It seems very unlikely. So the third theory that I'd like to look at today is self-efficacy theory, and this relates to the work of Bandura. And Bandura proposed that people are more likely to carry out an action and to persist with it in the face of difficulties if they're high in self-efficacy. And self-efficacy refers to the individual's belief in their own ability to carry out particular actions under particular conditions. So it's often referred to as confidence, but it's something a bit more specific than confidence. So for example, I might feel confident about eating healthily at home, but I might have lower confidence levels about eating healthy if I'm out in a restaurant, if I'm on holiday, if I'm with friends socialising and so on. And the same for other behaviours such as smoking cessation. Often people have different levels of self-efficacy in different contexts. And research using this model has supported the notion that self-efficacy is a very important predictor of health behaviour change. And it's important at all stages, from initiating an action through to maintaining that behaviour over the long term, and also recovering from relapse. So if we want to enable people to make changes to their health, we need to not only enable them to be confident to make that change, but also enable them to be confident to maintain that change and to be able to come back from any difficulties they face. One major advantage of this model is that it actually highlights how to change self-efficacy. A lot of models of health behaviour change include predictors of behaviour, but they don't actually tell us how to change those factors, which means that they're not particularly useful for developing interventions. Self-efficacy theory does explain how to change self-efficacy, and this is one of the reasons that it has been successfully translated into interventions, which I'll come on to a bit later on. But if you can see in the diagram here, the green boxes that are feeding into development of self-efficacy, these are the four main ways of developing self-efficacy. So the top box shows inactive mastery. So this is where someone develops a sense of confidence that's based on their own experience of performing the behaviour successfully. So if someone's done something successfully before, they're more likely to feel confident that they can do it again. The second is vicarious experience. So this is where the person develops a sense of self-efficacy from watching other people carry out that behaviour effectively. And that can be quite useful, particularly in group interventions, where people can see others with the same condition as them overcoming challenges and mastering particular changes in lifestyle, changes in routine, changes in emotional management. The third box refers to verbal persuasion. So this is where the person develops a sense of self-efficacy based on receiving positive feedback on their own performance. So they carry out a behaviour, they develop a sense of mastery, but they also get this positive feedback that allows them to feel confident that they're doing it correctly, they know what to do, and they can do that again. And the final box refers to physiological arousal, and this highlights that our own perceptions of our level of self-confidence is also influenced by our bodily signals. So, for example, if you're going to stand up and talk in front of a group of people and you're sort of shaking, you might notice that and you might think, okay, I'm not very confident in this situation. And it's the same for health behaviours. So if you're performing a behaviour or you're doing anything that is new and challenging, then you also take note of your own body signals. So in terms of interventions, the way this is addressed is by allowing people to talk about how they feel when they're making these changes and to provide reassurance around that. So this model also has advantages and disadvantages. As you can see, there's probably more on the advantages side than the disadvantages. In terms of the advantages, as I mentioned, it describes how to enhance self-efficacy, which is really important for developing interventions. It also emphasises that there's an interaction between the individual and environment. So we might have someone who's very confident at making changes to self-management regimes in certain circumstances but not in others, for example. And it recognises that behaviour change is a process, not a single action. And again, that's really important in the context of self-managing a long-term condition, because we don't want to enable people to do something once and that's it. We want to enable people to do something really for the rest of their life quite often, and also to be able to adapt that as their condition changes. In terms of disadvantages, one of the key disadvantages is that this model really focuses on one type of belief. It focuses on efficacy beliefs. And although these are important predictors of health behaviour, there are all sorts of other beliefs as well that people have about their condition that influence the way they cope. And this is where the final model that I'm going to look at today comes in. This is the common sense model of self-regulation, which was developed by Leventhal. And Leventhal proposed that people monitor their bodily symptoms all the time, and they notice if anything changes. And if it does change, this is monitoring here in this box, the arrow feeds across to evaluation. So this is where the person notices a change, and then they start to make sense of, well, what does this mean? You can see that then goes up to a box called illness representation. So this is the person's cognitive evaluation of what's going on. And below that is a box called emotional reactions. So also people have an emotional reaction to that change in their symptoms. And the model further breaks down these illness representations into key dimensions. So just to give an example, if I noticed that I started to have regular headaches, and this is something new to me, there's lots of different ways that I could interpret that. So I might think that my headaches are being caused by spending a lot of time in front of my computer. So then I might respond to that by having more regular breaks away from my computer. I might think it's due to something I'm eating, I might think it's because I'm having too much coffee, and then I might make some dietary changes. I might think that I have a brain tumour, and I might then go straight down to my GP or down to A&E and ask for tests, and that's of course going to bring a different emotional reaction as well. So this model is really a way of breaking down those kind of beliefs that people have when they notice a change in their health. And it highlights 5 key dimensions. So the first is the identity of the illness or problem. So this is the label that we give to the new symptoms that we've noticed, and what we think are the symptoms that are associated with that label. The second is the timeline. So one important consideration is this something that's going to go away? Is it something that's going to last a long time? Is it something that's going to get better or worse over time? And those beliefs will influence the course of action that that person that follows on from that evaluation process. The third dimension is cause. This is what do I think caused it, which could be something to do with environment, could be lifestyle causes, could be genetic. There could be all sorts of different beliefs people have about the cause of this symptom, and that again will influence the way they respond. The fourth is consequences. So this is what is going to be the impact on me of this problem that I think I have. And then finally controllability, which is typically broken down into personal control. How much control do I think I have over this problem? Is it something that I can change myself? And treatment control. So is there a medical solution to this? Is there a treatment that might be helpful? And all of these beliefs and emotional reactions feed into coping, and this can then feed back into changing our emotional responses and our bodily symptoms. So it's an ongoing process. So in terms of advantages, this model was developed specifically to explain variation in response to illness. So it's more useful than some of the earlier models, which really are looking at behaviour and performance generally and have been adapted to this context. It includes both cognitive and emotional factors, and we know that both of those types of factors are really important for determining the way people cope. It also recognises the importance of self-monitoring, which of course is crucial for most, if not all, long-term conditions. That person needs to be able to identify when their symptoms have changed and take appropriate action. They also need to be able to identify when they have a problem to begin with that would lead them to go to see their GP. And another advantage is that illness perceptions can be easily assessed. So there are lots of validated instruments for measuring illness perceptions. I've included a link here if you're interested in looking at any of those. And in our research, we've tended to use the brief illness perceptions questionnaire because that can be filled in quite quickly and easily within the course of a consultation. In terms of disadvantages, the model is still focused on the individual, so we don't really know where these illness perceptions come from and why people have these different beliefs. And it doesn't tell us how to change illness perceptions. However, more recent research is starting to combine this approach with approaches such as cognitive behavioural therapy and motivational interviewing, which are designed to change beliefs. So I'll move to have a look at that in a moment. Okay, so moving on to evidence-based approaches, I think it's probably evident at this point that self-management is not a unitary outcome. People who are self-managing a long-term condition need to engage in lots and lots of different tasks on a day-to-day basis, and this changes constantly over time. So there's no one universal approach to enabling people to make all of these changes and to maintain all of these changes over time. However, there are evidence-based approaches to enhance self-efficacy or confidence to self-manage, to enhance motivation to self-manage, and to address inaccurate health beliefs or illness perceptions. So I'm going to very briefly have a look at each of these now. Okay, so lay-led programs are the most common approach to developing self-efficacy, and these are typically based on the Stanford Chronic Disease Self-Management Program in the US that was developed by Kate Norrig. And these are typically a 6-week group-based program, which are led by people who have chronic illness themselves. So they're lay-led programs. They are developed specifically to target the components of Bandura's self-efficacy model. So the idea is not just to give people information about managing their condition, but also to enable them to have mastery experiences, to try things out, to get supportive feedback, to see other people making changes and learn about how those people have managed their long-term condition. Research in the US has reported really wide-ranging benefits of these programs, including changes in psychological well-being and healthcare use. Some of this has not been supported by research in the UK. So in the UK, we have the NHS Expert Patients Programme and other local programmes that are based on the Stanford model. And the reference here, Foster et al., is the most recent Cochrane review, which looked at evidence across these lay-led programmes. And they found that they do result in significant improvements in self-efficacy, but they don't necessarily impact on psychological well-being and healthcare use. I think part of the reason for this is that we have a different health system to the US, and part of the reason for this is that these programs are focused just on the patient, so they don't change the clinician or the system around that patient. So we can empower people to access healthcare in a different way, but if the system doesn't allow them to do that, then that's not necessarily going to translate into changes in healthcare use. An alternative approach is the train-the-trainer approach, and this is where health professionals are trained in self-efficacy theory so that they can use the approaches from Bandura's model to enable people to become more confident in managing specific aspects of their own care. And so we use this approach to help people who are delivering postural care to children with physical disabilities to feel more confident about doing this. And we use a train-the-trainer approach where the intervention was actually delivered by occupational therapists and physiotherapists who have been trained in self-efficacy theory. And we found significant improvements in knowledge, understanding and confidence in terms of delivering postural care. And I've included a link there to that research, which we've very recently finished. The most common approach to enhancing motivation is an approach called motivational interviewing, which some of you might be familiar with. This approach involves eliciting the patient's own motivation for change and helping them to identify and overcome barriers. So Miller and Rolnick point out that the traditional approach to encouraging health behaviour change is to provide the person with information about what they need to change. So to tell that person you need to quit smoking, or you need to lose weight, or you need to reduce your stress levels, for example. And they point out that that can actually be quite counterproductive. So if I were to say to everyone in the room right now, you need to do an extra 30 minutes exercise a day. Whatever you're doing at the moment, you just need to up that by 30 minutes. Now, if you notice the kind of thoughts that pop into your head pretty much immediately after that, there might be a few people who are having thoughts like, that's a great idea, I'm going to do that right now. But there are probably lots more thoughts saying things like, well, I don't have time to do that. I have a really busy life, I have a career, I have a family, I have to drive to work, I have to get my kids to school. So that tends to be the response when we tell people what they need to change, is that their mind immediately generates counter-arguments. So Miller and Rolnick suggest that we need to take a different approach. We need to elicit the person's own motivation for change. So rather than saying, you need to exercise more, we start the conversation by saying something like, well, would you like to be more physically active? Now, it may be that the person says, well, yeah, I'd like to, but in reality, I don't have time to. And then you've got something to work with, because you've got the fact that they said, yes, I would like to, and you can engage with that and you can find out, well, what do you think might be some of the benefits for you? If you did become more physically active, how might that change your quality of life? And really sort of delve into that to look at that person's motivation. And then on the other side, you can also look at, what is it that's making it really difficult? What is holding you back? What are the barriers? Are there ways that we can overcome some of those barriers? And are there sort of changes to the goals you set yourself around exercise? It may be that you can't do 30 minutes, but you might be able to do 10 minutes, you might be able to do it every other day rather than every day. So that way you work with the patient to develop a plan that is actually realistic for them. And the main principles of motivational interviewing are shown in this box on the right. So one of the key principles is expression of empathy. So this is recognising that behaviour change is difficult, and it's not just difficult for the person with a long-term condition, it's difficult for all of us, and we probably all have experience of feeling like I really should be going to the gym tonight, or I should be eating more healthily, but. So it's not an easy thing to do and to maintain over the long term. We all have times that we feel less motivated than others. Developing discrepancy is really evoking the patient's own reasons for and against change. So if people are in that position of, well, I'd like to do it, but there are things that are holding me back, you can actually draw up a balance sheet with them to look at what would be the advantages, what would be the disadvantages. On balance, is it in your interest to make this change? Maybe the person decides that it's not, but that's up to them to decide. Role with resistance is just to recognise that resistance is normal, that our brains do generate these counter-arguments as to why we can't do all of these things. And just to recognise that and work with it and to keep going in that process. And the final box there is to support self-efficacy. It's this questioning and reflecting to help the patient believe that he can change. So if you're looking at changes someone might be making to their self-management regimes, you can ask people about, well, have you tried this before and how did you get on? It may be that people have had some successes and that they haven't persisted with that because then they've hit barriers. So you can reinforce their self-efficacy by highlighting those successes and providing supportive feedback, then trying to find ways of addressing the barriers as well. So this approach was initially developed for treatment of addictions, but it has been used to care for people with diabetes as well. And there's a recent that's systematic review or meta-analysis looking at interventions with diabetes patients, which showed that it is effective for improving diabetes self-care and HbA1c. In terms of changing illness perceptions, there's lots and lots of research that shows that illness perceptions influence coping and outcomes for people with long-term conditions, but there's surprisingly little research on actually changing those illness perceptions. In our research, we've used an approach called concordance therapy, and this begins by assessing the person's illness perceptions using the illness perceptions questionnaire, and then using approaches from motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioural therapy, which are two approaches that are widely used to change beliefs and to change behaviour. So if you see the box on the right, I hope that this is readable from where you are. At the top, we start off by using open-ended questioning to explore the individual's responses to the illness perceptions questionnaire. So for example, you said that diabetes severely affects your life. Could you tell me more about this? What is it that concerns you about your diabetes? And you can then use approaches such as summarising, reflective listening, to review the person's illness perceptions and to help them to work through what the advantages might be for them, making some of these changes and enabling them to feel confident in doing this. So we've used this approach in a previous NIHR-funded study, which was a collaboration between the University of Kent and the Whitstable Medical Practice. We developed a manual for delivering concordance therapy with older people with type 2 diabetes. And we found significant improvements in blood glucose and psychological outcomes in that study. And more recently, we've also used this approach in collaboration with KCA, which is a psychological therapies provider, to train mental health workers to support diabetes self-management, so that when people are providing psychological care to a patient, if they also have comorbid diabetes, that they can use these techniques to enable them to become more confident about managing their diabetes as well. Okay, so I'd like to just draw out a few sort of key conclusions across this quite sort of broad body of research. And the first conclusion is that living with a long-term condition is difficult, and even patients who appear to be inactive and non-adherent are likely to be engaged in lots of efforts to manage their condition. And failed attempts to self-manage, including attempts to gain support when needed, increase the risk of frustration, anger and disengagement. And this is why it's really vital that patient self-management efforts are recognised and supported. The second conclusion is that information alone is not enough to change behaviour. And there's a very wide body of research to support this. And patients need to also feel confident and supported to make these changes. There are a number of ways of developing self-efficacy, so we've touched on some today. You can refer patients to self-management programmes, also local patient groups such as Diabetes UK support groups can be a really valuable source of support and help to develop self-efficacy through those channels that Bandura has highlighted, through mastery experiences, observing how other people have coped with their condition and so on. And you can also help to develop patient self-efficacy directly by providing mastery experiences. So any experience where the patient takes on something that they're not yet confident with, something that's fairly new to them, and they set a manageable goal around that, and they go away, make that change, come back and talk about how they got on with it, and have an opportunity for reflecting and working out what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and also getting some supportive feedback. Anything that involves that process will help to develop that patient's sense of self-efficacy. I've also highlighted on this slide that it's important to acknowledge past difficulties empathically and to provide verbal encouragement and reassurance. And the reason for drawing this out is that quite often people who've had a lot of past difficulties can appear to be disengaged and disinterested in self-management. And it may be that they have had lots of opportunities of trying to self-manage their condition. They just hit a lot of difficulties and a lot of barriers, and they haven't known how to overcome those barriers. So if you have someone in front of you who appears to be disinterested and disengaged, this is a way to find out, actually, are there some past experiences there that have led them to where they are, and are there some past successful experiences there that could be promoted and provide reassurance and encouragement around that. And then finally, I've just noted on this slide that support needs change over time, and so of course long-term conditions are not static. People's symptoms change over time, their treatment plans change over time, their life and circumstances change over time. So even if people have been given information and support at one point in time, that's very unlikely to meet all their future support needs. So this is really an ongoing process for people with long-term conditions to understand what are your support needs right now, what are you finding difficult, what are the strengths and weaknesses that we can work with in that consultation. The third conclusion is that emotional reactions to illness and inaccurate illness representations can act as barriers to self-management. So it's really important to explore the individual's beliefs about their condition and the role of self-management. When we've used the Illness Perceptions Questionnaire research and in clinical context, it's actually been really interesting to find out what people's beliefs are about their condition. And you quite often find that people who've had a long-term condition for many, many years have some inaccurate perceptions about that condition in terms of the cause, consequences, treatment approaches and so on, that's making it less likely that they're going to effectively self-manage. That might well never come out in conversation. It might not be something that that person feels that they can raise, and people sometimes feel quite awkward and embarrassed to admit that they don't know something, particularly if they've had this condition for a really long time. So I think assessing illness perceptions is a really valuable tool for understanding a person's difficulties with self-management. Psychological needs also need to be assessed, and we know from research that comorbid mental health conditions are more often missed in people with long-term conditions than people without long-term conditions. I think this is partly because of overlapping symptoms. So if someone is presenting, for example, with changes in energy and appetite, changes in sleep patterns, that could be because of their long-term condition. It could also be a sign of depression. So that can be quite difficult to disentangle sometimes. So some patients might require a referral to a psychological therapy service, but also research shows that sub-threshold needs, these are the needs that don't meet the clinical criteria for depression and anxiety disorders, can also have a really significant impact on self-management. So it's not just the people with comorbid mental health problems that experience this impact of psychological well-being on medical management. It's also the people who have difficulties with general stress and coping. And in this final slide, the final conclusion that I'd like to highlight today is that helping people to self-manage requires a collaborative approach, and a recent report by the NHS Confederation has highlighted that it's vital that conversation that clinicians have with people changes from what's the matter to what matters to you. So this means a change in the way we interact with people with long-term conditions, a change in the way that services respond to the needs of people with long-term conditions. And with the increasing prevalence of long-term conditions and multiple comorbidities, it's likely that knowledge and skills relevant to supporting self-management are going to become increasingly important in the future. I'd like to just end there. We're happy to take questions.